Hello, I'm Paul Briley, and you're listening to Off the Comma. I'm a human who cares about supporting other humans. On this podcast, we explore all facets of what it means to feel stuck in life. We talk with people just like us who have found themselves sitting on a comma and not knowing where to go next. We will unpack the experience with them, where they've been stuck, what it feels like, what they experienced, and what they learned. My goal is to inspire you by seeing yourself in others. I believe that when we feel more connected and seen, magic can happen. If you find yourself sitting on a comma in your life, remember, you can also talk to me without a microphone. To explore coaching with me and getting off the comma in your own life, book a call with me at offthecomma.com. In the meantime, let's get into this week's conversation. Welcome back to another episode of Off the Comma. I am excited to have a guest with me today who is new into my circles. And what I love about the conversation we're going to have is that this kind of represents how you just never know who you're connected to might be connected to someone, and then that brings somebody else into your circles, right? So you all have heard me talk before about, oh, this is somebody that I know, or this is somebody I've recently met and spent time with. And Joe, that we're going to be hearing from today, is brand new, and yet we kind of came together through a very interesting set of circumstances. You know, a guest that I had on who had been on his podcast, and then I listened to his podcast and vice versa. So I'm very excited to be talking to Joe today and hearing his story about his experience with sitting on a comma. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Joe. Welcome to the show, and tell us how you'd like to be known.
Well, thank you. I guess if I had to narrow it down, I hope that I come across as empathetic. I hope that's a big one. I feel like I've got a good sense of humor. I don't take myself too seriously, and but on the other side of that, I'm an advocate. I'm for the underdog. So I guess that's how I would describe myself.
Yeah, very, very human-centered is what I'm hearing. Like very much about your connection with others and how you see and support others.
Yes, very relationally driven.
Cool. What else would you like to share with us? Tell us a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, well, my name is Joe Smith. Shout out to my parents for the creativity. I've been married for almost 25 years. We have two kids, one that's getting ready to be 22 and one that's getting ready to be 15. Mm-hmm. We're here in Florida, Gainesville, Florida specifically. I'm a pastor of an open and affirming progressive church. I also serve on the board of our local Pride Community Center, and then I'm part of something called Parenting with Pride. That's part of Equality Florida's stuff here in the state. And for those that don't know, Equality Florida is the state's largest LGBTQIA human rights organization.
Okay. Wow. Nice. Sounds like you're very involved in your community, which really kind of reinforces what you were sharing about yourself as a person, right?
Yeah, we are. Yeah,
nice.
Very much so.
Well, I think we're going to learn a lot more about you through your story today, and I'm excited to hear as well. Joe, one of the things before we actually get into the interview and start the questions, one of the things I like to do with all of my guests is ask you, as you think ahead to the next 45 minutes to an hour conversation we're going to have, what intention would you have for yourself from today's conversation?
Well, I guess anytime I share my story, because I have people ask just because I don't know that it's a unique story, but coming from where I came from, my hope is always to be encouragement to people that we can all change. That just because we started in one spot doesn't mean we have to stay there. That we kind of, if we want to, we kind of just kind of own that story. And just because life is pulling you in one direction doesn't mean you have to go in that direction, right? Mm-hmm. And even in those seasons where it feels like it's pulling you one way and you can't go, if you just keep pushing through, like if you just have the courage to walk through that door. So that's always is just to help encourage people or to give people permission to stop being where they're at, if that's what they're wanting, right? Mm-hmm. So that's always my hope anyway.
Okay. That resonates with me. I think this is one of the things that has probably brought us together is it sounds like we have some similarities in that respect because I'm all about permission and people
Mm,
being able to make change in their lives, right? So my intention is to support you in the intention that you've just stated. And as with all of my guests and this community of us that this podcast is all about, is that out there someone will hear your story and there will be something that
mm.
resonates with them that will make them feel a little bit more connected, a little bit less alone, and in the best of cases inspired and even empowered to do something that they've been wanting to do with their lives. And
Right.
so
100%.
nice.
Yeah, I love that.
Nice. Well, let's do it. As with all guests, you and I haven't talked about the story you're going to be sharing today, so I'm really excited to hear about the story. We will do the same 5 questions that we always do, and that will kind of give us structure for the conversation. So let's jump in with the first question, Joe. So where have you found yourself sitting on a comma in your life?
Well, for me personally, I guess the biggest comma would have been just a very conservative, fundamentalist, evangelical kind of worldview.
Hmm.
Growing up, I mean, that's just what was handed to me. So I guess that would be the biggest pause, the biggest comma, the biggest, was trying to work through that, work past that, and it took a long time. It was very, very difficult, very lonely, very lot of anger and frustration, feeling like you've been lied to, especially those core tenets, right, that you kind of grow up with, that they kind of get rooted down into that lizard brain, right, the base of who you are, and then they just become foundational, and for good or bad, and then to discover that's not quite reality. And then, figuring out a way to rebuild, to move forward in healthy ways. I don't know how much you wanted me to jump into that just yet, but that's kind of,
let me ask
yeah.
let me ask a question here because there's a lot to unpack there. So when you look at what you shared with us, what I'm curious about is what part of that felt like being stuck or sitting on a comma, because it sounds like all of this was part of your experience. Where were you in this experience? Were you the holder of this, the keeper of this, resisting this? I mean, that's kind of what I'm curious about is what was this like? What was this experience like for you?
Well, that's a good question. So like I mentioned earlier, I've been a pastor. I've been a pastor my entire adult life. I've done it for 22, 23 years now. And so, so just always very people driven, but that whole like stuck idea was also not only was it part of my identity, but it was also how I fed my family. It paid the bills. The idea that, that there's only one way to see, God or the divine or whatever that word is for you, right? Like, it was a very narrow way of seeing the world, of expressing spirituality. And I would say I was probably, if you're talking about like this idea of like this pause being stuck, comma, it really began in earnest in 2015 and lasted, oh geez, I think it was probably 2020 into 2021, maybe 22, when I really kind of found myself again. So it was a long pause.
So when you talk about this, I mean, a lot of us, we hear things and we draw our own conclusions, make our own assumptions. It sounds like what you're sharing with us is that you lived in a place and worked in a profession where communally or collectively there was this worldview, and then you were feeling a certain way about it and fighting it. That's kind of what I'm curious about.
Yeah.
I mean, just to be like, did you grow up with this? Is this something that you yourself embraced and believed? And what is it you're describing?
Yeah, no, I grew up in it. I've always been drawn to the idea of God. I've always been drawn to this idea of spirituality, of this interconnectedness between us and something more, or each other, creation, all of those things. And so like, as a child, I don't know how many people would know this, but there used to be these things called a bus ministry, and these large churches would drive around buses and pick kids up in neighborhoods, and I voluntarily went, even before my parents got into stuff. But that was in Texas, and when we moved up to Missouri, my parents got involved with church, and it was a Southern Baptist church, and then that moved to Free Will Baptist. And if your listeners don't know anything about Free Will Baptists, if I could personify that denomination into a person, it's the fundamentalist preacher in Footloose that doesn't want anybody to dance. That's the church that I grew up in. And it was very much that way. And, we're the real Christians. All the other churches are kind of, but definitely the world is evil. People are evil. You're evil. I grew up hearing that like crazy. I developed a compulsion because of my fear of hell as a child, and it lasted well into my 30s, where if I didn't say a particular prayer before I went to sleep, I wouldn't go to sleep. And I mean, there were times, I can remember as an adult laying in bed and thinking, man, I'm so tired. Why can't I go to sleep? And then remembering, I haven't said my prayer. And I would say it, and then I could fall asleep. So that was kind of the fear-based religion that was handed to me. Fortunately, my parents, that was not my lived experience at home. And so they saved me from even more religious trauma than I would have had they been that way too in the home, but they weren't like that. They're still not like that. So they were kind of a bit of an anchor, but still, even at, 8, 9, 10 years old, you're hearing somebody that's on a stage that's supposed to be, somebody to look up to, or a professional, or in my case, it was like the voice of God telling me these things. Those things got, rooted down deep inside. And I'm sure that there are plenty of people that can resonate with that.
Yeah. Well, and I'm hearing this kind of story of in your formative years, in your youngest and most kind of learning and absorptive years, you had this kind of belief and connection already in you that felt innate and natural. And then in the community, it started to support that. And then also, it sounds like, distort and or kind of manipulate that in a way. Those are my words, not yours. So correct me. Anytime I reflect something back, you correct me. No, that's
exactly right. No, I think that's 100% correct. And I think that's where a lot of my anger and frustration came from, was because, I've always, like I said, I've always been drawn to this other, and it felt very much like it had become distorted. Now, I didn't have the language for that at the time. I don't even know if I would have thought that at the time. But looking back, once you kind of deconstruct, or however you want to deconvert out of, high control religion or very cult-like situations, you can kind of look back, and hindsight being what it is. But it was very distorted, very warped kind of. And that's what it does. It makes you see the world in this warped, distorted kind of way. If everything is bad, if you're coming from a place of scarcity, if you're coming from a place of, fear, then that's how you treat the world, right? That's how you treat other people, because, well, this is the baseline reality. So
in a way, that's how you're trained, right? Yeah, I mean, isn't that the right? It's interesting when we look back and reflect on things and kind of try to find the words to narrate it. It's like, wow, it seems like it kind of created, this is how I ended up looking at things. And yet, wasn't that kind of the intent in the first place? Again, this is us pontificating, right? But if you're part of an institution that holds a specific worldview, and that worldview is about focusing on evil and badness in people, isn't that kind of the intent, right? I look at so many other conversations we could have about the world today, and people, don't they understand? Yeah, they do understand. This isn't, when they start out doing these things, it's not, I didn't know what was going to happen, right? So, yeah, fascinating.
You're preaching to the choir.
Right. Well, and I jump in because I think there's the story, and then there's the what can it show us about the world too, right?
Right.
And so
Right.
what you're sharing with us sounds very stressful, and you've only just started to touch on what it created for you. I'm going to ask that next, but being in a world that is very focused on controlling your narrative, not just the narrative, and directing how you live your life and what you believe and think. I mean, that had to have been very challenging and very difficult.
I will say this, it was and it wasn't. And I think that this is part of fundamentalism. I think it's almost this, it's a groupthink. And then George Orwell's book, 1984, I can't remember the term that he uses, where you can believe and hold two contradictory things as true at the same time. But we were practiced in that. So I could hold in my mind, just for an example, that the Genesis creation account is literal, right? I could hold that as a child, that God created in 6 literal days, and the earth is only this many years old. But then I could go to school and learn about evolution and dinosaurs and, carbon dating and all these things, and hold that as true and not feel any internal struggle because I'd been taught to do that anyway. I will say the parts that were most frustrating, that were the hardest, was when it came to relationships with other people, because the things that we were taught, the things that we were told about those outside the church didn't match lived experiences. And so these people that I would, my friends or people that I, meet along the way, and all of a sudden they're not the thing that had been described from the stage, right? I didn't know what to do with that. You're supposed to be evil. You're supposed to be dragging me to hell with you, and yet you're not. Or meeting people of different faith systems and finding great joy and peace and love there, and in their life, and them sharing that with me. Right. That just didn't match what was coming from stage.
It's interesting because what I'm noticing is, you just shared with us this being able to hold two beliefs is true, the creation story and the evolution story, and not have any dissonance there, and yet shift to the example. And what I'm told about people and what I experience about people, you're not holding those two separate things as true. Now there's some significant dissonance there.
There really was. And I hadn't thought about it like that before, but that's very true. And I don't know if it's maybe because I'm just, my makeup, I'm very relationally driven. I'm very, very much a people person. So maybe that was my difficulty in that. And maybe if somebody was more scientifically or analytical, it would have been the other side. But it was, and that's how I began to move past this, was the relationships. It was those lived experiences. It was these connections that I was having with people where, I was being told one thing, but then all of a sudden I'm over here and I'm with somebody else, and it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck and walks like a duck. And it's in a flock of pigeons, and you know what I mean? Like that whole,
the emperor's wearing no clothes.
Right.
Yeah.
And I could not, it just started creating more and more and more cracks in that very fundamentalist foundation. And at some point, those cracks became too big and it all just crumbled.
What I'm hearing too, that seems like it's significant, Joe, is when we're talking about creation and evolution, like you don't have direct experience with that. You're going to take that however you take it, but you haven't touched it. But when it came to the relationships in your lives, you had direct experience. So now you're tapping into something else, right? Because wait, I'm in this. I'm seeing this. I'm hearing this. I'm feeling this. So it seems like
that's good.
It's a stretch here, but it seems like you started this story with, I always had a sense of something. I don't remember the exact words you used, but a sense of something greater or a sense of connectedness. And now here you are kind of tapping into that,
true.
It seems.
That's interesting. That is interesting. I had never thought about it like that. kind of learning stuff about myself as we chit chat. But
this is
that's
what's
true,
great though about people, right?
Yeah.
Is the mirroring and the being able to see
Right.
ourselves in each other and kind of hear ourselves from somebody else's mouth, right?
It's
the value
almost
in that.
as if, it's almost as if we're all connected.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Joe, I want to jump into the second question, but I want to be like respectful of your story. So I kind of brought you back to, okay, what was this experience like? You know, this, as you talk about this comma and so forth. And then you were starting to take us up to 21, 22. The second question is, what did sitting on this comma create for you? And I want to give you the opportunity to talk about that, but I'm not sure, does 21, 22 have to do with sitting on the comma? Is that the point where you started to shift off of it? Take us where you want to take us.
Yeah. So, you know, that whole comma period, like I said, really began in earnest in 2015. And for me personally, and not to dive into anything, you know, too whatever divisive, but it was the rise of Trump and the embrace of the evangelical church of this person. I had there, like I said before, there had been multiple cracks forming anyway, but it was the embrace of people who I had grown up knowing, that I'd worked with, that I'd, you know, sat in, you know, sacred spaces with, and talking about, you know, loving each other, treating others as we want to be treated. Whatever you do for the least of these, you do to me, you know, kind of teachings. And then just all of that being tossed out the window for a political win, you know? And I just could not fathom the church that I had known selling its soul for a presidency. And so that's really when it really began. And, you know, we all lived through those 4 incredibly tumultuous years. And it was like each year got worse because it had the previous year to build on. And so for me, that comma just got deeper and deeper and deeper, because it was like, I'm not describing anything anybody else didn't experience, but it was just like every day there was another thing, and it just became so overwhelming. And, you know, in my life, it created great despair. It was very much a soul or energy vampire. I felt very drained, very disillusioned. Any kind of strength and the faith of something else like really began to wane, you know, dry up. And there was that caused a very much, for me personally, a faith crisis of, is any of this real? Because I'm not seeing any evidence of it. And so it was just, I guess if it produced anything, especially initially, it was just that dark night of the soul kind of season, you know, where it was just, I mean, I can remember a moment where I was walking our dog, and we've got a little walking park at the end of our neighborhood. And it's just, you know, it's a beautiful area. I would walk the dog in the evenings, just kind of decompress, or I'd listen to podcasts or books or whatever. And I don't remember what I was listening to at the time, but I can remember I had to grab a tree. I had to stop the dog, and I put my hand on this huge oak, because whatever it was internally, it felt like the world had just completely crumbled underneath my feet, and everything was, nothing was concrete. So I had to grab onto something, because I felt like internally that I was just falling. I just was falling. And it was all wrapped up in, you know, that deconstruction, or however you want to phrase it. But the largest part of that pause for me was honestly despair, was darkness.
Can I dig a little deeper in that? I'm curious, and this is what I see as valuable moments of these stories, and why it's so important that we listen to each other's stories. We live in a society where we're taught to just automatically make assumptions, and yeah, me too. I know that. I know what that means, but we don't. And so, what's coming up for me is, as you're telling this story. And I sit on a specific, I'm not going to lie, I sit on a specific side of this fence, and it is not that other side that you've been talking about. And yet I have a responsibility to also like try to understand as much as I can. You're talking about this despair, this dark night of the soul. I can certainly relate to that as a person, but it also occurs to me that that's not everybody's truth. There were many people who were feeling quite the opposite that. Right? Many people, for every day that you had a dark day, many people were having a bright day. And so I'm not going to sit here and pontificate on who's right, who's wrong, good, bad, none of that crap. What made this such despair for you?
That's such a good question. You know, I think it was, I think it was the fact that this institution called the church, and maybe there's probably a lot of people that can't relate to this, but for me growing up, I mean, it was everything. And maybe that's, looking back on it, that was, unhealthy, probably so. But it was, I mean, I grew up in it. I went to seminary for it. I worked in it. My life revolved around it. And then all of a sudden it went from bride to, to, I don't know what would be the opposite of that. It just hoarded itself out. I could not understand. And so I was already in the process of like auditing my faith, because I was seeing things that didn't line up. My lived experiences didn't match things that I had been taught or was still teaching. And so it just was like this whole big mess of what the church was doing in the political world and the United States, and the harm that it was producing, specifically in marginalized groups, people of color, queer people, immigrants, the rhetoric that was coming from the administration that was being embraced and parroted by church leaders. And then this faith system that was crumbling anyway. It just kind of came together. It was like a perfect storm. And I didn't know what to do with it, to be honest. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to think. And so coming from a place of great security, and that's what fundamentalism gives you, right? It's a structure. It's a clear black and white thinking. These are the good guys. These are the bad guys. This is wrong. This is right. Very certain. And coming from that worldview, growing up in it, and then spending part of my professional career in it, and then all of a sudden that not being there anymore was incredibly disorienting.
And yet, here's what just came up for me, Joe, is you were, I mean, for all intents and purposes, you were trained that, as you said it, right? You were trained to be ready for this and to embrace this and to roll with it, right? Like you literally just said, like the security, all the things that we were taught and everything, like you were prepared to be okay with this, and yet you weren't. That seems like that's the pulling apart point that I'm hearing in your story, is there was something deep within you that said, despite everything that I had been prepared for, there was a different knowing within me.
Yes. That's actually a really good way to describe it, this pulling apart, because that's very much what it felt like internally was, the person that I had. Yeah, like you said, I think that's a 100% accurate. The person that I had been trained to be and how to teach others to be, when, the rubber hit the road, it just fell apart. It was like, I can't do this. Like if this is what my faith system is supposed to be, then I can't be a part of it, because I see what it's doing to people. It's harming people. And then part of that despair, add on top of that, for me personally, was the fact that I also propped up, perpetuated, taught things that harmed others. Fortunately, I've always been very relational, so I was always very careful what I taught from a stage. But that didn't mean I didn't have conversations with people, or support ideologies that I work feverishly against now. So there was a tremendous amount of shame and guilt, recognizing that I was a victim of this system, but then in my victimhood, I passed that on to others, right? That this thing that had been given to me that was still internally harming me, that I was just like, oh yeah, this is God here. I'm going to teach you this too. And then waking up one day, waking up over a time frame, and then realizing, oh, they did that to you, but you also helped do that to others. So there was a lot of shame and a lot of grief, and I made a lot of phone calls to a lot of people, to apologize.
Yeah. What I'm hearing, first of all, is, I mean, thank you for sharing this, because it's such a powerful example of, what internal conflict can look like. And we're all raised in different systems that really shape our beliefs, right? And I've heard so many stories. I have my own stories, right? And whether it's church and faith, or it's family structure, or it's the ways that families will take liberties with ourselves and our bodies, and so forth. Like, all of these things shape our systems. And at some point we come into our own, and then all of the things we've been taught and how much we've aligned ourselves with those are called into question. You led, when you were introducing yourself, with empathy. And what I'm hearing is that your empathy really started to stand out and to make itself heard, because so many of these things that you've experienced were a direct contradiction with the empathy that you knew to be true and important.
That's very true. And since, I'm not jumping ahead or anything, but I have since learned to apply that to myself as well. And I hold my past self with a lot of grace, knowing that I did what I thought I was supposed to be doing. And then when I learned better, I did better.
Well, and as you said, right, like, you literally were raised that in a way that you couldn't even go to sleep until you did certain things, right? So
Right.
Absolutely, I think we all have these things that we deal with where it's like, I did that thing, I'll take responsibility for it. And yet we can also give ourselves grace and say, well, again, back to what was the original intent? Well, why did I do those things? Because at that time, I didn't know what I know now, or I believed in the thing that I had been taught to believe in, right?
Yep.
And so, yeah, that had to have been challenging.
Yes, it was.
To say the least. Joe, what you were talking about 2122. The next question in this list is, what have you learned about yourself? But does that relate to 2122, or is there more to tell?
It does. Yeah. No, it absolutely does, because, I think, again, not speaking for everybody, because like you said, there's another side of that fence, right? But for us in 2020, with the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, just really brought, and not only the murder, but the response. And again, for me, it's specifically from the white evangelical church. The response from them was atrocious. It was heretical. There's not strong enough language to describe their response to these just historic injustices that were really brought to light, kind of came to a head, and it was a real moment. My wife and I, it was a real moment of, do we want to be a part of this anymore? We were part of a church here in Gainesville called Shift. That's the church I lead now. And even at that time, when it was still much more evangelical than it is now, it still it still was creating a different kind of third way, a different space. And that was the only thing that kept us holding on. And by that time, I was deep in the throes of, I don't even know if I believe in this anymore. I don't know if there is such a thing as God. I don't know. I just don't know. And so, into, that 2020 into 21 and 22, I did do a lot of growing. I did do a lot of learning. I'm a dog with a bone. So I just grabbed anything and everything I could read on just a number of topics. And I just wouldn't let go of it until I was satisfied that I had learned all that I could. And so, whether it was theology or it was African-American history or it was queer history or it was the question of inclusion within the church on those things, theology. I mean, I just didn't let it go, and I just kept digging and digging and digging. And I, looking back, I guess, what I learned about myself was that I was still trying to create that same fundamentalist structure and put something else over it. So I was still trying to find all the right answers. If I just find the right answers, it'll fix everything. And, there are some things that you can find the right answers to. I mean, there are some things that you can land on concrete evidence. And then there are other things that are just like, yes, and, or it's just, we don't know. And I really struggled with uncertainty. And that's what I was doing. I was trying to maintain the structure and then just clothe it with something else. And so I had to be careful. I had to turn off the TV. I stopped watching news. I haven't watched any news channel since 2020, the summer of 2020. I keep up. I read. I know I know what's going on, especially on the local levels, because we're in the state of Florida. But I had to stop being almost discipled, almost taught by the talking heads. Right? It's, yes, you're going to find news, but it's a business. It's news entertainment. Right. And so I had to be careful because what I was hearing and watching constantly was really poisoning my soul. Like it was, it was doing me harm. And so I had to be careful with that.
I'm hearing a lot of self-noticing and self-observation. Like what I'm hearing you describe is I definitely wanted to, again, pull apart, go a different way, find a path that still creates inclusion, feels right, and yet somehow still holding to the old ways within that desire, and trying to notice, like learning and noticing all at the same time.
Yeah.
What did you mean when you said I was still trying to create the same structure and put new clothes on it? You talked about that, but I really want to hear more. What did that mean?
So with a lot of the work that we do here locally, we help a lot of people coming out of those fundamentalist places, and the tendency is that you keep the same fundamentalist structure, and you just apply a different belief system to it. So you end up being just as much a jerk, even if the belief system is better or if it's healthier. But if your attitude is like, this is the way, this is the answer, a very binary black and white thinking, versus a more dualistic or a non-dualistic yes and way of seeing the world, then you just recreate the same thing. And you just use different language, but you essentially sound the same. Just swap out some words, and you're my fundamentalist preacher growing up. Your words sound better, but your attitude is the same guy that stood up on the stage and told me that I was lower than worms, and I was trying to recreate that with different language, with a healthier way, not realizing at the time that I was just using the same skeleton that had been handed to me already.
It's interesting. It's like the factory is still the same, even if the products coming through it are different. So, because there's still the same process and structure as you described. There's still the same binary thinking. And what I'm also hearing, you tell me if this is the right word, there's still righteousness wrapped around all of it.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of self-righteousness.
Yeah. And being right.
Yes. Right. That's it. That's actually that's actually a really good point that I'm glad that you said, because on either side of that, if it is that fundamentalist structure, the point is to be right. So whether I'm on the right or the left or somewhere in between, again, it's the same goal. I need you to think the way that I do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, whether it's for validation of what I think, or if I think this is the only way or the right way. That's exactly 100% correct. It was about being right, and I needed to be right.
And it's fascinating how easily, like in the human nature of it all, how easily we can shift, right? I mean, there's just so much to unpack in this in terms of what it reveals to all of us, right? To go from being completely right about something that feels wrong, and now I feel so strongly about the other thing that feels right that I'm right about it. And as you already said, we're still perpetuating the same structure, the same system.
Yes, 100%.
Fascinating. Yeah. So much for us to learn and notice about ourselves within that right there.
Yeah. It took, for me personally, it took some time. It took a mentor walking me out of that. I had to have a real moment, several moments of, real vulnerability, of real honesty, about myself, and about what I wanted or what I wanted to become.
Mm-hmm.
And at that, when I was in the middle of that, I did know the answers to those things. I just knew that I didn't want to be what I was, and I didn't want my life to continue to reflect that. And it was that moment, and I recognize that moment now. And it happened in another conversation just a few days ago, where I looked back and was like, I can actually pinpoint when that happened now. And I was sitting with that mentor, that friend, and we were in a Starbucks, and just in a room full of people. And man, I'd never felt so alone in my life.
Mm.
And I just looked at him and I said, I don't know if anything I think is real or not anymore. And I'm afraid I wasted my entire life. And it was at that moment, looking back, I couldn't verbalize it then, but it was in that moment that that I was able to begin to move forward.
Mm.
To use the language from that comma, I was able to begin to stop being stuck. And even if it was just like the next breath, right? It was just that I could, just claw my way forward, just like an inch at a time. And that's how it started. And it was in that moment that, that things really started to change personally.
Mm. Wow. And that was clearly very moving to you. Like what were you feeling as you were reliving that experience and you felt that sense of emotion? What were you feeling there?
Oh, just that despair again. It was so dark. It was just so dark. I don't even know if I can describe it. Maybe some of your listeners come from, or anybody coming from like a really high control religion, or like a cult like space where you're handed all that you need for your whole world. This is all you need right here. And it's certain and it's concrete and you can hold it and it's easy and it's like a warm blanket. And then to discover that is not only not true, but it's harming you and it's sucking the life out of you. And it's one of the historical evils of the world. And to face that truth. I mean, it was earth shattering.
Mm.
I don't even know if I can describe it. It was earth shattering. And I literally was afraid that my, I'm 47 at the time I was, I don't know, 45, and I was afraid that I had wasted 45 years on this earth. You know, we only have so much time,
Mm-hmm.
and I was afraid that I had wasted all of that time up until that point, and it was just I don't know, it was a personal hell. It was a
Yeah.
personal hell. But when I could verbalize that, um, I didn't feel it at the moment, but when I was able to verbalize that to my friend, um, that's when, you know, the next day was just, you know, that much better. And then the
Yeah.
next day was that much better. And then one day I looked up and I was just like, oh wait, this this doesn't look like where I was anymore. What happened? You know? Um, and then I realized what was taking place, and that's when I really, you know, kind of dove in head first with some of these things.
First, I just want to acknowledge you for that. This shows up more and more and more, and this visual that comes to me from all of these conversations is this human experience of this funnel, right? And you just told it again in a different way. This is me putting my spin on it, but like this experience that we have where our life is a certain thing and then all of a sudden it's starting to shrink and shrink and shrink, and then we're going through the struggle, whatever the struggle is, and we're going through the narrowest part of the funnel, and everybody describes this in different ways, and yet it's all the same. Like, I'm at that point of breakdown, 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 and then there's this crack, right? And it's always this gentle moment, the I've released it, the sigh, the deep breath, the pause, people talking about putting the pen down and going to sleep, whatever the case is. And then you just said it, like I've got goosebumps reflecting this back. And then the next day, it's like the funnel started to open. It's still very, very narrow, but it was just a little bit easier. And then, and then, and then.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, I mean, it's a perfect setup for me to ask the next question is, and so what changed for you?
Oh my gosh. Life. Life changed. And again, you know, like I think you said it perfectly, right? It was just a little bit at a time. But I began to let go of the need for certainty. I began to let go of the need to be right in all of these things. And at first it was a little disorienting, right? Because you're learning to walk again. And you know, my legs were wobbly, and sometimes you know, those steps were firm and strong, but more often than not, they were, you know, wobbly kneed, looking like a baby giraffe trying to walk the first time, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the things that I began to discover was just the rich beauty that is in life, and the creativity of our world and people. And I began to meet people. One of my good friends, Tamara Perry Lunardo, she is the board president of the Pride Community Center here in town, and I work with her, serve with her, and we started having conversations, and that led to meeting other people and recognizing, like, you are not what I was told, and our lives, my wife and I, you know, she went through this with me, not to the extent, because she didn't come from the same places, but she was part of the journey the whole time. And we met some of the most beautiful people and relationships that have just made our lives so rich and deep.
Mm.
And I get choked up thinking about it, because I'm so thankful and grateful for that dark season, because had that not happened, I would have never met these people.
Mm-hmm.
And I would have never experienced just true unconditional love. Let me tell you, like, the first conversation that I had with Tamara was over the phone, and she took my phone call knowing where I had come from, knowing what I had spent my life doing, and she still took that phone call, and she was so gracious. and allowing me a space to learn and to grow and to ask questions. And it wasn't her job, right? It's not her job to fix me. It's not her job to give me permission to do those things. Like, I'm a grown man. I just didn't know where to start. And she was so gracious in doing that. And and that's where we do a bulk of our work now, is within the queer community here locally and in the state. And I often say that I have never experienced unconditional love like I have from them. And I don't mean that as a broad stroke, like, to just paint everybody. We're all human. We all have things, and some people, my past is triggering, and I 100% understand. But my experience, the overwhelming experience, was one of love and acceptance. And since that time period, it's that deep beauty and connectedness that then drives us to do the things that we do now. It is the fuel behind all of the work that we do. And I discovered that this idea of God, how could, if there is a God, and I'm okay with saying that. Like, people ask me, I describe myself as a Christian agnostic. If there is this thing, God, right? If there is this universal spirit of love, if this thing that drives the engine of existence, right? Then how in the world could we possibly create a box and say, this is what that thing is? And I have found that to be incredibly beautiful. And so to me, that also fuels this idea of this interconnectedness where, I can talk to my Jewish friends and my Muslim friends and my atheist friends and my agnostic friends and my Buddhist friends, and there are still commonalities that we all share. We shared values. So that's the thing that we really focus on now, is shared values, not shared beliefs, right? Because I can believe different things, and if it's not value based, it's still whatever, right? Like, okay, great, but how is that producing goodness in your life? How is that producing goodness in others? And so we stopped asking the question, is this true? And we started asking the question, is this helpful? And if it's helpful, good, then let's go with it, right? Where before the question is, well, is it true? Because that's the fundamentalist structure. And so, those are things that have just, made our lives just so, I don't even know how to describe it. It's just so much better.
Yeah, let me reflect back. I mean, there's so many things that I'm personally taking from this, right? Like, first of all, just this observation, the sheer irony that the thing that you, and tell me where I'm wrong, or if I'm wrong in restating this way, the thing that you thought you were creating and that we're striving for and seeking, you didn't find until you went on the other side of the belief system that you were, trained.
100%.
And then also this, like, as somebody who's empathetic, whether you identify as an empath or not, but somebody who's clearly deeply connected with feelings and the feelings of others and human experience, look at how intensely you felt those feelings on both sides of that funnel, right? The deep despair that you described. And now I'm seeing, because I get to have a visual experience with you here, right? And we're hearing this deep sense of something far warmer and more loving on the other side of that funnel. So still the same feeler, still the same intense capacity for emotion, right? But look at what the things you get to feel are on either side of that funnel.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's absolutely correct. I often say that that I have been blessed to work out my daily repentance for the years that I was in places that was harmful and supported harmful ideologies and things. And honestly, you can dismiss this, and I understand why people do, but much of it unknowingly, but still doesn't relieve me of any of that responsibility. So now on the other side of those things, that is a deep motivation of like, these are people that I love. I mean, I deeply love them, and they love me, and they love us. They love my kids. And how dare you? How dare I at one point in time, and so that is a driving force for the work that we do as a faith community, but also personally, of what I have found to be true on the other side of that. Yeah, I like how you put that. That's exactly correct.
You know what else it looks like to me, Joe, is that you're also showing us, because we hear this talked about a lot, and people who are listening know what this means. It's not what happened to you. It's not what happened to you. It's what you made it mean. But there's also maybe you didn't create this, but you are responsible for it, right? That's the second one, was what was really primary in my mind. And you're showing us how we can easily look back at these experiences, because you're taking accountability for, roles and behaviors and actions that you took in the past, right? You're taking accountability for it, and you're taking responsibility for it. You're showing us the distinction. And yet I think you're also showing us that taking responsibility doesn't have to be a punishment or a sentence. Like, yes, there is work there. And yes, there are things that I have to own and ways in which I need to do and be different. And yet I can still have a better experience as a result of that responsibility.
Yes. And I will say, I don't always walk that really well. I have a lot of imposter syndrome. I struggle with that quite often. Specifically because of where I came from. And then, your listeners can't see me, but I am straight white. I am the seat of privilege in the United States. Like the system is built for me. Right. And so I do struggle with that imposter syndrome, but at the same time, it's like, yeah, well, okay, that's you. That's your internal struggle. Suck it up. You still got work to do. And if I can use that privilege, if I can use those things, that I've learned and the language, and I can pull that forward, right? Not because I believe it, but because it's still helpful for me in what I do now. So, helping create that better way forward. Just recently, we're facing, the state of Florida leads the nation in book bans. And so there's a big push with the Quality of Florida. It's called Bring Back Banned Books. And so there's groups of us that go to these school board meetings and stuff. And when I talk to these school boards, when I talk to our city council and to these other people, our legislators, I can use the same language. When you say certain things that my colleague here that's with me, not from this space, has no idea what you're actually saying, I know what you're saying. Because I know what those words actually mean, and I can use the same language. So it's almost like, I don't know if you're familiar with his work, Richard Rohr, but he has so many good books. But one of the great quotes he has is, all great spirituality is what we do with our pain. We either transform it or we transmit it. And so, so those things that created pain, I feel like now we get the opportunity to transform that and use those very structures, use those very words, use those very beliefs to push us forward in healthier ways, and whatever way we can here locally. And so, yes, I struggle with some of that stuff internally, but I can't let that get in the way of the great privilege that has been, the universe, life, God, however you want to work that out, has just laid before me and said, hey, you've got this background, you've got this training, and you can now use it. You can use it in a way that helps a wide variety of people. For anybody that's listening that may be specifically talking about being an ally and advocate, my voice is not centered. It cannot be centered. It just cannot. For us now, recognizing that what are doorways for so many people has been a hallway for me. It's just a hallway. It's just one big open, here you go. And so now my responsibility is to not force somebody, right? But because of the privilege that I've been given, I can help hold that door open for somebody else that normally that door would have been closed to.
Mm-hmm.
And I take that seriously. I mean, I think that's a deep, I don't know if responsibility is the right word, or, but I take that very, very seriously. And, which is why for us, like the whole podcast thing is centering the voice of queer people in this space. And it's not my voice, but we did create a small platform for them to use their voice. It's things like that like you said, it's the reason you have to say something, because you did sit in those boardrooms. You did help with those decisions. So now you have to say something because you saw what it was like when those doors were closed and nobody else saw it. So I that resonates with me deeply.
And it can be a powerful change in all directions, right? It's not just now, hey, I'm shifting and I'm going to stand up for the individual person or what have you. You can also show other people back in those old rooms how it can be different, right?
Yes.
Right. This isn't about necessarily tearing anything down. It's how can we make all things better and build, right?
Well, it's like when we were talking just a little bit ahead of time, it was that the quote I saw this week that I would rather strike a match than curse the darkness. Mm-hmm. And I think that's exactly what we're saying. And that you're saying too is like, it's not about tearing you down, and it's not about tearing others down. There are things, and I will say this too, because I spent my life in it. There are many, many, many things about the modern American church that need to be torn down and never seen again. But it can't just be that, right? It can't just be demolition. Mm-hmm. Like we need to create something that's better, that's healthier, that serves all people and not just a select few that look like me.
Mm-hmm. Joe, as we wind down, the last question is, what does getting off the comma look like for you?
Oh, man. I thought about this, but like the direction of our conversation, it just kind of changes and goes. I think for me, it's just continuing to do the work and sharing in that work with other people. One of my greatest joys in life, and I do this all the time. One of my greatest joys in life is sitting for coffee with somebody, whether it's in person or Zoom, because I do both, and helping them. That coming from the same places that I came from, right? That's where that's what I know, and helping them work through that same process of. I had a conversation just a week and a half ago of somebody that I've known for, oh my gosh, I don't even know how many years. And they are still in church. They're not currently now, but they were still in church spaces that we had come from, knew the same people, worked with the same staff. And just through this relationship that we had, and they knew what we had gone through, reached out and we started talking, and I was helping them see some of the same things that I saw, and they were like, oh, there that is. And and helping them in their journey of healing and rediscovering, and to use the language of your podcast, to get off of that comma, to get unstuck and to begin to move forward in healthier ways. So for me, honestly, it's then now getting to participate in the work and showing people it doesn't have to be that way. Like that's not, like, I understand that that's what we were given and we were told that this is the way life is, but that's not true. And it doesn't matter what those people are saying to you now, because it doesn't. You don't have to give that. You don't owe them anything. Mm-hmm. And life is so beautiful over here. Mm-hmm. So here, let me show you how you can move through this. And it's different for everybody. So it's not, sure. You know what I mean? I don't have a 5-step program. It's literally all just conversations and just like pointing things out that I saw, or helping them see, or giving them resources from somebody else. So it's not like I'm an online coach or anything. I don't do that, but just in my pastoral role of just like, hey, this is what we were given. And it's not true.
Yeah.
And so look over here, because it's so much more beautiful. And again, is it true or is it helpful? It's helpful. So let's go there.
And here's what I also see, Joe, and I see it in you today, and I've seen it over and over and over again. And I'm writing a memo to myself, right? Is And I can do this with you because I'm a fellow human being and because I've been in that funnel that you're in right now.
Mhm.
Like, look at everything you're doing now that it begs the question, could you have, had you not squeezed through that funnel yourself?
You
Right.
know, I don't think so. One of the books that meant a lot to me was Falling Upward, and it talks about order, disorder, reorder, and without that disorder, you can never get to reorder.
Hmm.
But you also need the order, right? This first half of life, very binary way of thinking to push back on that creates the disorder eventually, if you're willing to grow past it. And then it's through that season that then the reorder happens, and it's
Hmm.
cyclical. It never ends. It's
Hmm.
growth, right? I mean, that's just what maturity is. But yeah, it is that. We never would have been where we are had we not gone through what we did.
Yeah. Joe, thank you for your story. Let's kind of do the digits here. So, where could people find you if they wanted to contact you or see what you're up to, follow your content?
Yeah, I'm on all the socials except Threads. I couldn't do one more. So, but I'm on Facebook. It's just Joe Smith on Facebook, and the real Joe Smith on Instagram and TikTok. I'm on Twitter some, but not so much. That's kind of a just a one gigantic cesspool anymore, and I can't I can't swim in it.
And we'll
But
put these links in the show notes,
right,
obviously. Yeah.
yeah. So I'm that you can find me on it there, and it's all public. I don't have
Okay.
private stuff.
Okay. And I've checked out your platforms. I mean, you do
Yeah,
have you're posting, you're active
yeah,
out there, you're putting things out there that are of interest to people. So okay.
yeah.
One thing else, Joe, that we do here, because in this podcast, I believe very firmly that part of your story is also the people that you talk about or that you touch and that you interact with in your community. You've already shared that with us. So we do this thing called acknowledgments, where I give you the opportunity to give a voice to, boost, lift up, promote people within your community who might not otherwise get the visibility. So who would you like to acknowledge? And of course, all of the links will be in the show notes.
Yeah. So first of all, I want to shout out to our my tribe of weirdos. Some of them are part of our faith community at Shift, and some aren't. But um, they, it's a very unique situation. They give me the space to do these other things that aren't very. They're not a traditional like pastoral role, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they allow me the opportunity to do all these extra things, and they see it as just part of an extension of our faith community. So
Mm-hmm.
Shift and my leadership team, they're amazing. Pride Community Center of North Central Florida. Um, of course, we'll share this, but the board members that I serve with under Tamara's leadership and Don Smith Lopez, who's the vice president, just do tremendous, like life-saving work. I get to work with a beautiful human named Deb with our student meetups, and I mean it is 13 counties, and we can't do all the things that we want to do, but they are just phenomenal people serving in in a state that just is actively trying to get rid of queer people and people of color too. But I think that those are my biggest two shout outs, especially locally. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, Joe, thank you for coming on, sharing your story, sharing your experience, letting us have this conversation and dig a little deeper. So very much appreciated. I didn't ask you earlier, but I'd love to close with what would you acknowledge yourself for now, having looked at the conversation we've had?
Why? I do not like talking. I don't do compliments well. So I don't know. I guess if you're putting me in a corner, I guess I would acknowledge that I was willing to be self-aware, that I was willing to recognize the parts of myself or the things that I was doing were not helpful. Were not helpful, but they were harmful. And I think, if anything, it's just the being able to be self-aware enough to say, I'm wrong, and I've got to do something better. And then the work of doing that.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, and I'll acknowledge you for what you said very early in the conversation, which is people don't have to stay the same. It is possible to change, and it is possible to be fluid. That's my word, not yours. And so, you really just shown us that and acknowledged yourself for that.
I guess I did. I don't like talking about myself much like that, but yes, I did do that. Yes, thank you.
Wonderful.
I appreciate it.
Joe, thank you again. Have a great weekend, and I will look forward to having more conversations with you outside or without the mic.
Yes, I look forward to that too. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
What an honor and a privilege it is for me to witness these powerful stories. I hope you feel the same way too. I invite you to think about what you learned from this conversation. What stood out for you? What challenged you? What inspired you? And I encourage you to write it down in some form of journaling and reflection. It can be magical to set aside your expectations and just let the thoughts flow out of your head and onto paper, and surprises can reveal themselves to you. And if you do discover something you'd like to unpack further, book a call with me and let's talk about it. My links are in the show notes. Meanwhile, be sure to like this episode and follow the podcast here on this platform. Also, follow me on social media at Off the Comma. Interact with the posts, share what you learned from each episode, or just share your thoughts about the topic in general. And check out my website for workshops, events, and updates. If you were moved by today's conversation, pass it along to someone you care about. Thank you for listening to this episode of Off the Comma. As always, keep noticing and keep listening.